Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and delighted to be with you today to talk about an important topic for the political and economic health of our country that doesn't get discussed much these days, at least not in any serious historical and political way, which is the national debt. The title of our webinar today is The National Debt at the Founding and Today. This webinar is part of Ashbrook's political economy program, which we've recently started with the generous support of the Thomas W. Smith Foundation to help educate students, teachers, and citizens around the country on the proper relationship between government and economics. We really think the political economy program is part of our overall mission here at Ashbrook, which is to educate our fellow Americans, whether those are students, teachers, or citizens, in the history and founding principles of our country, and in the habits of reflection and choice that our founders believe were necessary if we're going to perpetuate our republic. That educational mission has been what Ashbrook has been doing ever since we were founded back in 1983, with a particular emphasis on economics and economic freedom and the importance of the proper relationship between government and economics. So it's a delight for us today to return to that conversation on this very important topic. And we really believe, as I've said many times, that education is not about information and definitely not about indoctrination, but about discovering the truth for yourself through conversation. So today we're going to have a conversation about the question and problem of the national debt. Join us in that conversation, please, through the Q&A function. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, comments for our panelists and for me, please send them through the Q&A, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. Sometimes we can't get to all of them. I apologize in advance if that's true today, but we will try to get to as many as we can. Joining me for the conversation today is Dr. Robert Wyllie. Rob is Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Ashland University. He is also Director of Ashbrook's program in political economy. It's really fitting that he is joining us for this conversation today. Rob teaches classes in history, politics, and especially political economy for undergraduates and for teachers in our graduate program, and across the country in seminars. Rob teaches classes on the foundations of political economy, on 20th century political economy, capitalism and socialism, and on American political economy. So he teaches and is an expert on the very subject that we're going to be talking about today. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia. He and I share an alma mater. And he got his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Rob, if UVA and Notre Dame play each other in football, who do you root for?
This was a problem just last weekend.
That's
right. It doesn't matter that I was rooting for UVA, apparently, because after the 28-3 shellacking we got.
Well, Rob, while he was at Notre Dame, did his dissertation on the political thinker Baruch Spinoza, who was a 17th century political thinker who's often connected with the rise of modern democracy. And Rob did his dissertation on a very interesting subject, both for politics and economics, which was the problem of envy, which turns out to be an important issue in modern democracy. Rob is a man of many talents. He is deeply learned, sort of has become in our history and political science department here at Ashbrook. If we don't know, we go ask Rob. And he's developed that sort of reputation. He's deeply learned. He's an engaging scholar. He has published articles in journals like Perspective on Political Science, on political thought. He's working now on a book on the problem of envy. He is also, besides being a college professor and scholar, was a high school teacher for 4 years. So he's had that experience, and an athlete. I just found out today that he was captain of the water polo team at University of Virginia for 2 years. So a man of many parts, but in particular, a scholar and a teacher and a thinker on political economy. So Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let me get started if I can. This question, the national debt. I think there's some confusion. People see this in the newspaper, they see it on television, on the news, but they don't always know what people mean when they say the national debt. Let's just start with this. What is the national debt? What do we mean by that?
One way we could start is just by explaining the difference between the budget deficit, the national debt, and then the debt ceiling, which I can predict with a high degree of certainty will be in the news in about 3 weeks' time. So first of all, a deficit is simply when you spend more money than you bring in. And I believe it's the case that through payroll taxes and other revenues, the federal government brings about $3.5 billion, and year after year it spends about $4.5 billion. And as people know, trillion dollars. I have to get my buzz and my trizz straight for this particular topic of conversation. $1 trillion. And as those of you know who spend $4 trillion a year, once you do this enough, you run into debt, right? And the government finances its debt or secures its debt by selling bonds, right? By selling treasury bonds. This is not a new problem, right? The national debt is older than the Constitution. States had debts before the federal government assumes them in 1790. The American Revolution had to be financed somehow. And so debt is not a new problem. And even though, as you mentioned in your introduction, it's not something we talk about historically, and as I teach American political economy to the Civil War, I'm always reminded of this. But today, the national debt stands at almost $29 trillion. I think the debt ceiling, so the amount of debt that Congress allows the Treasury to sell, is $28.4 trillion. And that debt ceiling is set by Congress. It's been set by Congress since 1917 to fund the First World War. The Treasury wanted to sell war bonds and needed to go to Congress to ask permission for how many to sell at the maximum amount. Since then, it was $11.5 billion, I believe, at that time. And since then, the debt ceiling has been raised 78 times. Treasury Secretary Yellen seems to think that it was going to be December 3rd that we would run out of money and have to raise the debt ceiling again. Now she's saying that it's, as of yesterday, she's saying it's going to be December 15th. So we can all look forward to a nice Christmas time conversation about what the debt ceiling should be raised to for the 79th time.
It's staggering. So what you're telling us is that when the United States runs a budget deficit, when the federal government does, it has to finance that some way. And so what you're telling us is a staggering amount of almost $30 trillion. We have sold bonds out on the market to individuals, capital firms, foreign countries, foreign governments who buy these, and our government uses that money to finance the federal government.
Right, and that's important to point out who owns it. So of the roughly $28 trillion, the federal government itself owns about $6 trillion of its own debt. That's called intergovernmental holdings because it has trusts, right? Of the largest of those, but not a majority of that, is the Social Security Trust. So all those trust funds are invested in government debt. About $22 trillion of that is held in public debt by American investors, sort of regular Americans, also in some cases by foreign governments. So most famously, China as well as Japan, those reserve banks own about $1 trillion of the federal debt, and they own everything from a treasury bill that you could buy for 1 year, 1 year paper that you can go back now for a 0.17 rate of interest, or a 30-year, over 2%. So this is all debt that's sold out at this point to 2051, 30-year maximum.
Okay, so you said now, though, the staggering number of 30 trillion, we sometimes think that the debt is a new problem. that this is a new phenomenon that we're hearing about ever since sort of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. But even the title of this webinar suggests, and your opening remarks indicate, that the national debt has actually been an issue since the American founding. Take us back to the American founding. What's the situation that the country faces with its national debt, and why was it such an important issue?
Okay, so country was not only conceived in liberty, but the country was conceived in debt and inflation, crippling inflation. So at the time of the American Revolution, as I said, someone had to pay for it, right? Soldiers were issued continentals, paper money, and they were very dissatisfied when that paper money didn't have much purchasing power. So there were these financial problems already. A lot of that were American financiers, people like Gouverneur Morris, who played an important role in the founding in some cases. And in other cases, that money was owed to foreign governments. So the Kingdom of France, of course, which would head into a revolution based on its own debt crisis 10 years later. So debt crises in the late 18th century, if you didn't think those were a big idea, or sorry, a big deal, the French Revolution would prove otherwise immediately. And the founders knew this, right? We also owed money to the Kingdom of Spain and the Dutch Republic. So the revolution was financed by these countries and they had to be paid back. Although this debt in many cases was issued to states, because of course the federal government didn't exist yet. And the Continental Congress didn't have the authority to issue its own debt. So it couldn't raise money. The Continental Congress might raise money through land sales of federal territories. That was the hope. But they couldn't raise money through direct taxation. Neither could they raise money through selling debt. And so one of the issues around the Constitutional Convention would be, could we found a federal government that could take on debt, that could borrow money? That was one of the major issues. And then by the time the Compromise of 1790 rolls around, and anyone that's familiar now with the Lin-Manuel Miranda Hamilton musical will know that there's a little rap number about this now. Would the federal government assume the debts of the states? So Virginia had paid off much of its own debt, and the Virginians weren't too keen on this proposal. Why the federal government's going to assume the debt of the much more indebted northern states? Why should, why we don't need it to assume this debt? Why should we pay indirectly through federal taxation for their debt that they haven't paid? So these were already part of the founding debates. And in some way, they're part of the first compromises that put the federal government together. But I try to stress in my class, though, that there's one deeper way that this is important. And it's important because it bears on the principles of natural rights that the American Revolution was fought for. And if those principles are that we should govern ourselves, then the idea that we have to pay debts of prior generations that they have incurred, right, and that we are now responsible for them, was obnoxious to many of the early American revolutionaries. So Thomas Jefferson is writing to Madison from France shortly before the Federal Convention. He's saying this would mean it would be the rule of the dead over the living. So at the founding, rightly so, we think about how the problem of slavery is obnoxious to natural rights, and whether that was really part of the founding, or how the Republic solves that problem in the Civil War, or begins to solve that ongoing problem in the Civil War. That's very well known. But I think in some way, the problem of debt and natural rights is much less well understood, and yet I think no less theoretically interesting. Yeah. To us, or shouldn't be.
So let me ask you this then. We know some of us who've seen the musical Hamilton, we know that there was a big dispute, and you alluded to it, between some American founders over whether America should have a national debt, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or how big it should be, or for what purposes. And the arguments of people like Thomas Jefferson against Alexander Hamilton. What was that dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton on the debt?
Okay. So in some way, first of all, it's a practical debate because the United States, at least the states separately, do have debts, and they have to be paid somehow. And paying debts for the American Revolution, well, that's something that a lot of the American founders think it's worth paying debts for, right? One interesting document, and this isn't skipping ahead into the future as much as it may sound like, but in the early 1830s, Albert Gallatin writes a memorial and remembrance about the debt, which is the United States is on the cusp of paying off its revolutionary debt, not until 1836. It's ultimately paid off in the Jackson administration. And this is the one time in American history that the federal government had paid down a debt, and at which point the federal debt was zero. It's only happened once in 1836. But on the cusp of that, Albert Gallatin, who's still writing about these matters, although he was Jefferson's Treasury Secretary some 30 years earlier, he argues, of course, Americans wanted to pay the debt for the revolution, right? Americans are proud to pay off the national debt so that we're an independent country and we can govern ourselves. Self-government came at a price, and we are proud to pay it. The question was whether we should run more national debts for national improvement. Paying a national debt for the American Revolution was something that was seen as very different, and this became the contentious political issue of the era, and was the issue between Jefferson and Hamilton before Gallatin expresses it this way in the 1830s. It's a debate, in other words, that doesn't get settled. Improving the country, right? Building a prosperous country, Western roads, these kind of improvements, building a military, building a navy. Could we justify national debt for these projects? So I think that in the early republic, these were seen as two issues. The relatively uncontroversial issue of, in order to liberate the country, in order to fight the war of the revolution, we incurred debts, versus incurring debts for the future economic growth of the country. In that case, that's an argument that I think goes all the way down between Jefferson and Hamilton. And sometimes we don't study them, especially if they're taught in the political history of the United States. Not enough attention is given to just how deeply read both of those men are in economics. And one of the reasons that it's hard to pay attention to that is because economic theory was still in its infancy, at least compared to now in the late 18th century. So Thomas Jefferson has a view that any investments of capital that are not ultimately reinvested into the land or into agriculture are sterile and can't promote economic growth. In this, I think he comes to some of these ideas independently, but in this, the French economists of the period think that's true as well. The intuition behind that idea among the French economists is that when you produce an agricultural surplus, your population grows. But when you produce surpluses in manufacturing, you have waste. So they think. So by this intuition, all capital needs to be reinvested. Therefore, the things Hamilton was talking about, new businesses, new manufacturing, building an army, building a navy, Jefferson couldn't quite put together how that would really equal economic growth, so much as just changing the distribution of income and building a new elite that would dominate the new country. But when you understand Thomas Jefferson is writing introductions to Destutt de Tracy's political economy. He's brought over Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours. He's engaged in all of these discussions, and they just have a different theory about how economic work. It's free market theory, but those French economists are a bit different because they argue all of this has to go back to the land. So this question about debt and whether debt can generate new economic growth is one between Jefferson and Hamilton that goes all the way down to say Hamilton has read Adam Smith and is starting to think about how taking on debt, the government borrowing money from itself, as it does with the First Bank of the United States, that's going to lead to growth in the future. But Jefferson thinks that will be a tremendous waste of money. And even though I think we know that Hamilton is right in hindsight, if you look at the balance of evidence in the late 18th century, early 19th century, I don't think there's a way that either, I think they both have they've read the cutting edge economists of the period, and I think it's really going to be an experiment. And sometimes we don't give them the credit for having done all the reading when in fact they have.
That's amazing to me because you've got two of the most prominent public figures and politicians of the age. I mean, two amazing things you said there. One of which is these practicing politicians were deeply read in economics and economic theory. They might have had different views, but they had deeply read these things and studied them. I think that's a lot different from maybe from a lot of public figures today, for sure. The other amazing thing you said was by the 1830s, America had paid off its national debt. We had zero national debt. So the national debt argument continues, but the national debt as a problem is gone from the Revolutionary War. Fast forward for us from that time in the 1830s when America has no national debt all the way through the 20th century where we start to accumulate national debt. What causes the rise again of national debt for the United States?
So there's a moment in the 1830s when we're going to pay off the original debt of the Revolution, and the old Jefferson-Hamilton argument about whether the federal government should go into further debt to promote economic growth becomes a question again. Interestingly enough, because Jefferson is politically so dominant in this, the Revolution of 1800, as he calls it, the Federalists are thrown out of power. But during the administrations of Jefferson and then Madison, they want to avoid the War of 1812 at all costs, right? They want to embargo goods with Britain and force Britain to sue for peace and not invade. They end up in the War of 1812 anyway. Jefferson ends up buying the Louisiana Purchase. Even though they're the opponents of more government debt at that period, the necessity of taking on government debt, in fact, lands itself on the Democratic Republicans. So another thing that I admire about the founders is once you see how theoretically learned they are, and Jefferson has his own problems with debt his whole life. There are biographical reasons, and I don't want to deny that. I just think what gets neglected is just how studied he is. On the other hand, despite being so studied, when it comes to practice, they find themselves in situations where, by necessity, the United States is going to have to build up a military to defend itself. By necessity, now the United States is a massive sort of continental federal territories in the West. We have to build roads out there, right? So even though they're theoretical opponents of the national debt, as a matter of practice, it comes to look a little different. Okay, in a way, I think we can skip forward and we don't have to talk about Henry Clay and how this sort of American system is going to work. Although I would like to say one thing, which is that now there's an interest in, I think this was particularly true during the Trump administration and the new turn to tariffs. There was a sort of rediscovery about American political economy, and the American system of Henry Clay has always envisioned a strong role for government in building domestic improvements. From, there were some Republican votes for the recent 1.75 trillion infrastructure bill that was passed last week, right? So is it part of the American system that the government has this role? And what's interesting is that Henry Clay has his American system and Albert Gallatin has his. So you can go all the way back from the 1830s and the founding and find that this is a debate. The next time that, the modern case where the government borrows money and it's limited by a debt ceiling or a debt limit comes in 1917. And this is war bonds for the First World War. And the only time that debt climbs to over, so a lot of times when you measure the national debt, you measure it as a ratio to GDP. Larger countries that are larger economies can sustain more debt, and as the GDP grows, you can pay off debt. So
for those of our listeners who are not economists, GDP is gross domestic product.
Right. So you can envision it this way, right? A government, an economy that's going to grow into the future. This is something that Hamilton is able to derive without resorting to modern economic lingo like GDP, right? But if we can plant the seeds of economic growth now, in the future, it will be easier to pay for this because these will be relatively paltry amounts of money that's invested, even if we can't pay it now. once we have those future dividends, we can grow out of debt, right? So since the early Republic and since Hamilton, people have been talking about growing out of debt, and they still do now. Although what people forget about Alexander Hamilton is he always says, if the debt is not excessive. And Alexander Hamilton, as a matter of fact, when he's justifying the American Revolution as a student at Columbia, Hamilton argues that it's because Great Britain has an excessive imperial debt, national debt. This is why we need to separate ourselves from Britain, or else we'll pay the crippling taxes that the Irish and the British have to pay. So there is a worry with growing yourself out of debt, that you can take on too much debt at the beginning that you'll never grow out of. And that's a part of Hamilton's legacy that, again, as this becomes a distorted debate that gets almost cartoonized, right? Hamilton invents modern financial systems. Not quite. Jefferson is just nostalgic for an agrarian farming past. Come on, he's the best read of all these guys, right? So we sort of ignore the nuances and complexities of that debate, but you can hear echoes now, like GDP growth. As a debt to GDP ratio, it plummets in the 50s and 60s. And so the thought is that even though we had borrowed all of that money to fight the Second World War, to be the arsenal of democracy, because of it post-war economic growth, we were pretty much able to pay that debt down or service it to manageable levels, right? And so by the time the 1980s roll around, I think there's a general sense among economists that debt is a problem that's been kept well in hand. And it's not until the problems of the 1970s that economists start to think that the tools we have at our disposal to handle the problem of the national debt may not actually be up to the task.
So a couple of questions. We've got lots of questions coming in, and a couple of, I think, are connected to this topic. One of our listeners wants to know, so are you saying that for people like Hamilton thought that in order to develop our country, we had to incur a national debt? And that was part of the thinking up through the 20th century to finance things like roads out west, canals, and all the stuff that would be later used for commerce and business.
Right. Here, I think what's important is that the first Bank of the United States isn't like a central bank in the contemporary sense. So there's a lot of enthusiasm behind Hamilton now, that Hamilton is forward thinking. And I think some of that is a bit undeserved. So I'll say a few reasons why. So the first, so Hamilton argues in the report on manufacturers that people are so set in their ways, so irrationally afraid of failure and so timid that they need a bit of a nudge from the government to get into a new, sort of a new field. So Hamilton maybe today is remembered too much as a fan of tariffs, because actually in 1790, he thinks that the government should pay what he calls pecuniary bounties, or what we could think of as government subsidies, so that the government can predict what profitable enterprises of the future will be and fund those, to fund innovation, right? Green energy, whatever we think that we get subsidies and tax discounts that if the government just nudges us towards it, the economy will take off in those directions. Hamilton gives a plan about that. But that plan seems to deny that private citizens can spot those opportunities, right? It seems to deny Adam Smith's idea that if there is money to be made by lending money, then we will charter a bank, right? And this gets into all sorts of the constitutional questions about whether chartering the first Bank of the United States was constitutional, when in fact the Constitution does not expressly give Congress the power to charter a corporation. So the first Bank of the United States, for all intents and purposes, was just like a private bank. It just raised capital and lended it out. And it was to stimulate the financial industry. Well, Americans aren't going to get into banking, so the federal government will bank with the Bank of the United States, and that will create capital for the future. That's not exactly the way that's not exactly the way a Federal Reserve System works, so that's not exactly the way that modern central banking works. So that's nothing quite new. And you might think that Hamilton is also sort of not optimistic enough that Americans will step up to the plate and sort of make banks if there's money to be made in banking, et cetera.
So take us then to, you said through the 1950s and 1960s. Debt grows, of course, during World War II because the federal government's selling war bonds to pay for the war effort. But in the 1950s and 60s, it starts to pay back. The economy grows, it gets more tax receipts, it starts to pay back those bonds. And then the national debt as a percentage of the whole national economy starts to go back down to what people were thinking is a manageable level. So it sounds like we've accepted by that time that there'll be some national debt. It won't be zero, but it will be a pretty small percentage of the overall economy, and we'll keep it healthy that way. But then debt starts to take off in the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s. I mean, if you look at the charts, you see the line just starting to get very steep, and has gotten steeper in the last 10 years for sure, but it starts to accelerate. What happens in the 1980s, and particularly the challenges faced by Ronald Reagan with the national debt?
Good. So post-war economic growth catches everyone by surprise. So I'm not sure that any economist, and post-war economic growth in the 1950s is still something that's extremely controversial, and how to explain that in retrospect. Many people at the time thought there would be a much longer readjustment as the troops came home, and that these would be further disruptions of the economy, instead of the sort of amazing growth rates you find in America and Western Europe in the 1950s. So that's still something that economists are trying to explain. But by the time, so in the 1980s, if you look at a chart, the debt to GDP ratio starts to rise precipitously, and then it just skyrockets. And the usual case that you will hear, well, there are two ways to solve a budget deficit. You can either cut spending or raise taxes. The way to increase a budget deficit and therefore eventually increase the national debt is to cut taxes and raise spending. And I think the usual argument is that Ronald Reagan is personally responsible, and the Reagan Revolution is responsible for increasing the national debt because it increases military spending in the arms race with the Soviet Union at the same time that it cuts taxes in the United States, and cuts especially the highest marginal income tax rating and so on. This is not the whole story on the debt. And that's a good news for the reputation, I think, of Ronald Reagan, but it's bad news for us. So let me explain why. So it's good news for Ronald Reagan because another part about the debt to GDP ratio that you don't factor in if you just think about it this way is how much it costs to service the debt. So when interest rates are higher, right, it's going to cost more to have borrowed money. You're going to pay more to service the debt. And of course, right before the Reagan administration came the Treasury's Volcker shock. So interest rates are about 20%. When you're facing interest rates of 20% and you've borrowed $1 trillion, you owe a lot of money every year to service that debt, right? Now interest rates are very low, and when interest rates are below 1%, it doesn't cost you as much. So our national debt now, even though, as you mentioned earlier, it's approaching $29 trillion, it doesn't cost as much to service because interest rates are so low. They're 20 times lower. So on this argument, Reagan is not actually responsible for the debt to GDP ratio rising. That's because the government has to borrow more money in order to pay the cost of paying down the debt that had already been borrowed by previous administrations. And I liken Ronald Reagan's situation in some way to the founders' situation. The founders founded a country that was deeply in debt, and they didn't like it, but they also didn't think that they had many tools at their disposal to get the country out of debt very quickly. And I think Reagan is in a similar sort of situation where, tragically, he doesn't like the debt and he realizes the problem of the debt. There's just no way to get out of it quickly. And I think economic historians have actually come around to give Reagan higher marks, realizing that interest rates and the cost of servicing the debt had a lot to do with the increased debt to GDP ratio. That's bad news for us, by the way, because right now we may be facing higher rates of inflation. And we don't have, if we raise interest rates, and maybe the Fed is looking at in the next 5 years to increasing interest rates, we'll see when they do. But as the Fed raises interest rates, the United States national debt is going to become that much more expensive to service.
That's an important point, because one of our listeners raises the question, and I think maybe you've addressed this now, who asks that one view says that a measure of the reasonability of the debt is the cost to service that debt. And as you're saying, that's right. That's one important way to think about it, not just how much we owe on the principal, but how much we also owe in interest, and wrap those two things together to understand the total amount, and it's reasonable. So you're saying that Ronald Reagan faces this unpalatable situation of having a debt that's been accumulated, but because interest rates get lower, we don't have to pay as much. The federal government doesn't have to pay as much to service that debt. So the burden is not as great as it might appear on paper. But in lately, though, certainly starting in 2001 with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and after that period, debt in the United States seems to have just exploded. It might have rising like this in the 1980s, but then it starts to turn in the 2000s. In the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, debt actually leveled off. And in the year 2000 budget, I think the federal government was projected to have a surplus, which sounds astonishing to us today, who are so used to budget deficits of $1 trillion or more every year. But then in 2000, that's the situation. But then 9/11 happens and other events. What causes the explosion of our national debt? What has caused it in the last 20 years?
Okay. So the last year that we ran a budget surplus, a national budget surplus, according to the CBO, is 2000. So the year 2000 was the last surplus, or might have been 2001. But in any case, it is exactly around that time that is the last surplus. And in any case, it's been 20 years since we've run a surplus, and deficits have been getting larger. This is a problem that's going to snowball, right? Even if your deficits get smaller, you're still adding cumulatively to the national debt. And so you're going to have to pay more to service it. Even if deficits are shrinking, any deficit at all is going to increase the net size of the national debt, right? And increase the cost of servicing it. Why has it increased? Since the beginning of the coronavirus 19 pandemic, the national debt, projections about the national debt, especially projections about the debt to GDP ratio because of lost economic growth, you can see it rise exponentially. If Reagan in the 1980s was worried, so on October 22nd, 1981, we passed that $1 trillion national debt milestone. And Reagan said, if we as a nation need a warning, this is it. And we added $1 trillion to the national debt in the first 4 months of the COVID-19 pandemic alone. In some ways, this, I think, is responsible. So if we remember, Jefferson in our ear is saying, if you have a national debt that you can't possibly pay, this is something that you're paying the debts of today, and you're fobbing the bill off on your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, heck, at this point, maybe great-great-grandchildren. And that's not fair, because they're not born into the world to pay your debts, right? This is a natural rights problem. On the other hand, when you face an economic crisis like we have in the past year, you might wonder if responsibility for the future may mean something else. If you don't tackle that problem now and think about how you're going to sustain economic growth for a growing population, right, then aren't you doing your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on a disservice? It's one or the other, right? And at some level, I think it becomes, and we can talk about why we haven't talked so much about why debt itself is a problem. But even in the past year, right, we've seen the national debt really exponentially increase. So some of this is the war on terror. Some of this is tax cuts during the Trump administration, tax cuts during the Bush administration. Certainly, as revenues go down, deficits go up. Not as much projected growth. Sometimes things that are unforeseeable. and in some cases increased spending and increased payroll spending. So just this month, or just 2 days ago, I saw the Congressional Budget Office thinks we've added $256 billion on that infrastructure bill, right? So despite those who say that that bill is going to pay for itself, the accountants say otherwise, and it's always difficult to know if something's going to pay for itself based on projections in the future. So yeah, I think things like that is why. And there's another problem. I think just the most fundamental problem is people become inured to this problem. There are a lot of zeros and your eyes glaze over.
I mean, I was going to, in fact, that's one of the things I was thinking about, because you made this interesting point, which is contrary to what some people might think, all of the American founders, including Alexander Hamilton, were worried about debt, or at least excessive debt. It was all, in their mind, it was a problem. I don't hear a lot of public figures today and politicians talking about being debt hawks, being deficit hawks, saying, hey, the federal government should not spend more than it takes in. It doesn't seem like there's a political consensus that debt is a bad thing. Is debt, and in fact, one of our questioner listeners is asking, what are your thoughts on raising the current national debt? Is debt a bad thing? Today's politicians they don't talk like it is, and they don't seem to be acting on that.
Right. So let me tackle the question this way. Let me suggest why some people don't think this is a problem. And then I'll come back and maybe give a little brief for the founding fathers and say, no, this is a bit of a problem we should worry about, and why that, some of our principles of self-government run up against the problem of debt. So there are many people today who think that the national debt is not an economic problem. Look, it's gone up and up, and the Dow can go up at the same time. The economy seems to be humming along. Projections of economic growth, these things can go together. Some people argue, well, the national debt isn't going to be a problem until we reach the point that the federal government is not able to borrow money. When it comes to borrowing money, this means what are the markets for United States Treasury bonds like? There was a question in the queue about the rating of those, and they went down from AAA plus to AA plus. But when you're looking at buying bonds, you want a bond because you want a sort of guaranteed return on the investment, even if it's not much. And the United States government is still seen as a very trustworthy way to do that. Get a sort of low yield bond back, or low yield return on your investment, short or long term. Because when you're an investor, you have other options, but your other options are Chinese bonds, Brazilian bonds, European bonds, and you can buy those, but it's a question, it's never a question of, are people, it's always United States debt or other debt. And I think for that reason, demand in the bond markets is how you can tell whether are people buying bonds. Well, then they think the United States is going to pay its debt, and they think the United States is good for it. If the United States isn't good for it, well, I think the United States will always be good for it, but you might get money that gets printed in a government that allows inflation, because the government can also inflate the currency to pay its debts, and that might worry some of us, that it might tolerate higher levels of inflation in order to pay its debts, or not honor pension obligations. Okay, so those who think that national debt isn't a problem say people are buying treasury bills, so things are fine. They continue to buy securities. And so we can continue to borrow money, and as long as it seems like a good plan for economic growth in the future, don't pay attention to the astronomically high numbers. Don't let them scare you. What do you say to that? Well, first, the astronomically high numbers probably underestimated severely. So when you think about unfunded liabilities that the federal government has, you have to think about the promises it has made to pay people Social Security, including mine. So, 100 years into the future, all the way out. And when you try to calculate how much the federal government is liable for, it's much more than $30 trillion, right? We're talking hundreds and hundreds of trillions of dollars at least. And so the government has higher, so don't confuse the national debt in any given year with the total number of unfunded obligations and liabilities of the federal government, which might be more and might get us to think that the federal government is a little more bankrupt than we thought and might be tolerating higher levels of inflation. So that's one. The other is it might be a problem by crowding out investment. So so every time you buy a treasury bill, right, every time you buy a bond, you're not investing in, say, an index fund or whatever. You might also have a sort of low yield conservative investment. And so the more money that's invested in this growing national debt isn't money that's invested in the private sector. And so this is the problem of crowding out. You might think that there is a crowding out problem with people that buy national debt rather than investing in markets. And then you say, well, now there's all of that lost growth that would have otherwise, if you think that these business firms that you might have invested in otherwise could use that money to better use and grow the economy. Well, we have to take into account that all of this money was spent on treasury securities, et cetera. The federal government may have not always invested this government wisely in ways that got a large return on investment. And then you subtract the net economic growth that you otherwise would have had. So, economics is sort of a game of trade-offs in that way. And some people think there is this sort of crowding out trade-off when it comes to buying treasury bonds.
So let me ask you this. This has prompted a question from one of our listeners who asks you to comment on what's called the new MMT, modern monetary theory, which I know is something you've thought about and perhaps even written about, that says we can just easily and forever continue to increase debt and print money. What do you think about that new view?
Okay, so so modern monetary theory, or MMT, is actually, I don't think, as new as its proponents who are selling a lot of books say. And this is because there's a paper by Abba Lerner, the sort of Keynesian economist in the middle of the 20th century. The way that an MMT proponent will sort of argue about macroeconomics is say they tried to debunk what they call the government household analogy. The government is not like a household. It is not going to run out of money. The government will always pay its debts because the government can issue the currency in which those debts are paid. So another cheeky way to say this is $30 trillion national debt is not a problem for a treasury that can mint $1 trillion coin, right? That's the intuition.
So they're saying, look, don't worry about the national debt because the government can just print the money necessary to cover it.
Right. And that's true. And the argument here is that the downside will be inflation, right? That dollars will be worth less once we do this. And so the radicalness of the proposal, and the radicalness is already there in Lerner's paper maybe 70 years ago. The government really doesn't need to tax you for income. It doesn't need to tax you for income because it can simply print money, and inflation could be that tax. So the government can finance its own operations, and the only limit to government self-financing its own operations is inflation. And then we just trust the wise men and women of the United States Congress who can very effectively manage inflation on a week-by-week basis, by wisely tailoring their spending accordingly. So even if the economics of this are sound, and I have some doubts, the political hopes of this project I know are unsound, right? Because I don't think anyone thinks that the United States Congress can actually spend money with an eye on inflation wisely. Okay, so I think there are just, and when I write about this, I write about, do these people even understand how our political institutions or our political system works? So, others debunk the economic side, I think, fairly effectively, but I'm focused on the political problems with that.
Well, that's an important point because we're talking about debt now as an economic problem, and we have been, but it's also in many ways a political and even a moral problem.
Right.
You've said that before. What do you mean by that?
Right. So I think that whether you want to think of the Stamp Act Congress or wherever, you think no taxation without representation, and you think that actually our government has a fiduciary responsibility to us as taxpayers, and the citizen as a taxpayer is a bit of an antiquated notion, but it's an important notion. that it's our government because it's our money and we have some say over how it's spent. You'll notice that the proponent of MMT and the proponent of just increased government debt as a fine way to finance the future avoids this problem, because the government finances its own operations. In the case of debt, at least for the time being, the bills come due. In the case of the new modern monetary theorists, never. These are just numbers that you don't have to worry about until inflation kicks in. So it's just about, maintaining the money supply. But in both of those cases, I think it undermines our principles of self-government, that the government isn't actually responsible to us for how it spends our money. Now, you might think that's a rather important political principle. And those of us who spend a lot of time teaching the founding of the United States think about that as a very important political principle. And an important principle that limits our government, what it does, an important principle that motivates people to take responsibility for what the government does and hold the government accountable. And so I worry morally and politically about this. It's not only the case of saying trillion-dollar problems, not for you and I, this is for the experts, right? That's the first move, that's the progressive era move, and that's disturbing in and of itself. The move has gone further now, that this isn't even our money anyway. This is just an entirely abstract economic problem where it's the experts that can manage inflation and future economic growth, and it doesn't really concern us at all. And that's what I think is really disturbing, and that's the reason I think we have to put these problems of debt in a historical perspective. I think that's why Ronald Reagan's argument, envision a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high. That's $1 trillion. Get it? Why is it important for us to get it? Because we have to understand what this means, that we could take responsibility for it, or else we've given it up to experts, and we've, I think, been tricked into the idea that this is an economic calculation game that doesn't concern us. And once we're tricked into that, you would have to be a very optimistic person to think that self-government is at all possible or operative.
If we're going to govern ourselves, it doesn't mean simply governing ourselves politically, but taking financial responsibility for ourselves as a nation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
everything we do politically has a price tag.
That's right. That's an important understanding of the relationship between economics and government there. We've got a question here. Just wondering, after all this conversation about the explosion of the national debt, the abdication of political responsibility for governing ourselves wisely fiscally, new theories that seem to be arguing we don't have to worry about this problem, even though economic science and political reality says that we do. One of our listeners says, how do we deal with this problem? How do we pay back this debt? What are some of your thoughts on this?
I think there are two temptations. I think one temptation has already been spelled out, and we don't have to go back to it, that let the experts manage it, and even defer to the most jejune experts that say it's not a problem at all, even if they're not the most grounded in what I consider to be sound economic science all the time. Okay, economic science. That's one temptation. I think the other temptation is to say default is inevitable. The American system is built on sand. All of this money is going to come due. Interest rates being artificially low. This is an important part. Because we have so much debt, we have to continue to keep interest rates low. To finance debt, this means that we're a people that just borrow, and eventually this makes us spend money unwisely, and a great economic crash is inevitable. So the thing to do is to invest in a porta potty and some 22 ammo. And I think I want to accept neither of these, right? I'm not a prophet of doom, and I think that is another kind of irresponsibility. And what I think we have, although, on gloomy days, I buy people like that.
Well, on an optimistic day, what are a couple of ideas you have for tackling the national debt?
Right. We have to, I think we have to take a responsibility for it, right? And there are, again, only two ways to do this. right? The only two ways to do this are to raise taxes or to cut government spending, right, over time. We've already covered the ways of, oh, here's how we're going to grow the economy in the future, et cetera. So I think it's important to raise the debt ceiling. You can't allow the government to default. I think allowing the federal government to default, one, it's not going to happen. But two, if it did happen, that would be catastrophic. In many ways, people wouldn't get their pension money, right? Social Security trust fund. Even if the Treasury has to go through extraordinary, every time you delay that, so you'll remember the 16-day government shutdown in 2013, even every time you delay that means if the Treasury takes extraordinary measures, it's not making daily investments for the Social Security trust fund. So every day you have that government shutdown, and you know that they're going to, come to some agreement. But every day of that shutdown means the federal government isn't managing its own daily investments so that it can use that money to pay its debts, right? And so that means you're increasing the future problem. So I'm not one of these, government shutdown, starve the government, because that just defers another problem along the lines. It's a long-term thing, right? It's a long-term way of bringing government back within its means, spending only on things that actually help the economy, never having wasteful spending. That's harder for Washington, as we all know, than it should be. And then taxes, right? You have to tax people against this problem, right? We all want lower taxes, but if it's at the cost of putting burdens to later generations, then that's irresponsible. So it probably has to be both, right? There are two sides of the ledger. And I think it's also, cutting and raising taxes and cutting spending. But we're responsible for a problem we're already in, right? Or we need to take responsibility. I understand with Jefferson that, we'd like to think we have, because of our natural rights, these problems of the past are not our problems, just default. But we have a responsibility to the future, and we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens. And I think we need to take that responsibility and not shirk it in those two ways that I mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are sober but very wise words for us to think about as we go again to contemplate this problem of the national debt. Rob, thanks for taking the time with us, joining us today to talk about this. It's such an important issue. We're going to be hearing about it more, as you said, coming in December. And this has given our listeners a chance to really get a historical and deep political perspective on this economic problem, and showing us again the importance of thinking for ourselves about the proper relationship between government and economics. And as you said, Rob, if citizens, if after all our government, we're governing ourselves, this is not just somebody else's problem, it's our problem to deal with. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate you joining us. We'll be sending you all a link to a recording of this. Please send it out to those who might be interested, to your children, grandchildren, friends, colleagues, anyone who needs to hear this important insight and message on the national debt and the situation that we face today. If you are new to Ashbrook and are interested in the Ashbrook Center and what we're doing, take a look at ashbrook.org for teachers who are joining us, teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org. Lots of tremendous resources, primary documents on the kind of issues that Rob has been talking about historically and politically today. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Even at the end here, taking the idea that we can take responsibility for ourselves and govern ourselves wisely economically, that possibility can give us some hope. So as always, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you for joining us.